In 1996, a relatively novel concept in tourism actually reached fatal popularity. In 96, it was about the peak of experienced mountaineers who began commercializing, or not began, but they had been commercializing their expertise in climbing mountains, and they were selling this ability to would-be climbers who wanted to summit on Mount Everest. But part of the problem is they were commercializing their expertise to climbers, to clients whose only qualification was little more than their ability to afford the expedition. And so this left photo shows base camp of Mount Everest. You can see there are literally hundreds of people who are crowding the base of the mountain in hopes that their hired gun guides are going to get them to the peaks of Mount Everest. Well, on Friday, May 10th, 1996, sort of the peak of this commercial expedition industry, 33 climbers bottlenecked in the single file conditions that exist when you get closer to the summit of Mount Everest. And so you can see some of these conditions. They're getting within a couple hundred feet, and there are just certain places where you can only go one person at a time. And when you've got a whole bunch of climbers, like 33 climbers, for instance, as they had in 1996, there are just major delays. So May 10th, 1996, 33 climbers bottlenecked. By the end of the next day, 8 of those climbers would be dead. By the end of that year, Everest would claim the lives of 15 climbers all total, a single-year fatality record on Everest that still stands to this day. But one particular story that I want to draw your attention to from the ill-fated May 10th, 1996 summit attempt is the story of Washington State postal worker Doug Hansen. Hansen, the year before, had put $65,000 cash on the table for a failed summit attempt. And so in 1996, did I say 96 before? In 95, $65,000, blew it, stopped short of the summit. So the next year, 96, Hansen was determined that he would not miss the summit. And his guides for hire, New Zealanders Andy Harris and Rob Hall, all but guaranteed Hansen's success. Well, Hansen gave it his all and fought his way to just shy of the summit of Everest, about 40 feet shy. He ran out of juice. And his guide, Rob Hall, who had been waiting there for him, helped him ascend the final 40 feet to achieve his life goal of summiting Everest. But there were 3 problems behind Hansen's summit success. The first problem is, by the time Hansen had summited, it was 4 p.m., and 4 p.m. was 2 hours after a literal drop-dead turnaround time on the summit of Everest. You got to get up there and back down before the evening conditions hit, which are fatal conditions. 2 hours late. Second problem for Hansen's summit success was he was out of oxygen. Also critical. Third problem is Hansen had spent every ounce of his physical reserve, as I said before, to reach the summit, and he had saved absolutely no strength for the descent. And so within 90 minutes of reaching the summit, Hansen was completely unconscious there on the summit of Mount Everest. So his guide, Rob Hall, did his heroic best to get Hansen down off the mountain. But as you may know, in the oxygen-depleted altitude near the summit of Everest, above 8,000 meters, it's a zone that's known as the death zone. And because the oxygen conditions are so depleted, even the best climbers in the death zone exhaust themselves, absolutely physically exhaust themselves, out of breath, just taking one step under their own weight. Just one step. It would be like you and me running a mile, or for some of us, like 20 yards, completely winded. But the best climber is just one step in the low oxygen conditions of Everest. And so it's virtually impossible then, even for the best climbers in the death zone, to carry the dead weight of an incapacitated climber. You can just barely take one step, let alone carry the dead weight. And so when it became clear that Hall would not be able to get Hansen down from the summit on his own, he radioed his fellow guide, Andy Harris, who had already begun his descent back down the mountain. So Harris headed back up the mountain so that Hall and Harris could try to get Hansen's body down. Long story short, all 3 men perished on Everest that weekend. Rob Hall's body was found just a couple hundred feet below the summit of Everest. He had progressed no further in the course of about another 24 to 36 hours than about going up and down the length of this room a couple times. Harris and Hansen's bodies have never been found to this day. Now, there were a series of errors that led to the tragic deaths of so many climbers on Everest that particular weekend, but in the case of Doug Hansen, no error was greater than this. Hansen had set his goal short of what his goal should have been. Hansen had been determined to reach the summit, but the finish line for Hansen and the finish line for Hansen's guides should not have been the summit. The finish line should have been getting back down to base camp. The summit was not the place to rest. The summit was not the place to become contented that you had achieved what you needed to do. The summit was the place to be still seriously concerned about where you were. Interesting, after first service, somebody pulled me aside and said, "Hey, I just came back from a conference that I was at. The 3rd time they've had as their motivational speaker an Everest climber." It's like, I don't know, I'm tired of hearing about Everest. But he said, interestingly, all 3 people have talked about summiting Everest as, that's the goal everybody's doing, but it's actually a short-sighted goal. Getting to the summit of Everest is not the goal. It's getting back down to base camp where the finish line actually is. And because so many people have been short-sighted on their goal, that's why there's about 220 bodies littering the slopes of Mount Everest. Because they set their goal short of what it should have been. That was Hansen's danger. And that too is the punchline of our text this morning for us spiritually. That there is danger in setting our sight short of the actual goal. There is danger in becoming complacent in where we are right now in our spiritual track. There's danger in sitting down where we are and taking off our oxygen masks and relaxing in our spiritual journey as if we've already arrived, as if we're already at the finish line, when the truth is, where you and I are right now, this very moment, is a place where we should, in fact, instead of being complacent, instead of being contented, is a place where we should be seriously concerned still. That's the punchline of Hebrews 4, 1 through 11 this morning. We haven't arrived at base camp. Base camp is still out in front of us. True rest, Hebrews 4, 1 through 11 tells us, is still out in front of us. And that's the title that I've given the message this morning, True Rest. But if I give it a subtitle, it would be The Danger of Catastrophic Complacency. A couple pieces of background information that may be helpful to help you understand this passage. In climbing Mount Everest, there's this area along the northeast route of the summit of Everest that's earned a very lovely nickname of Rainbow Valley. Rainbow Valley. And it's so named simply because of the many multicolored down jackets of the numerous corpses of climbers whose bodies litter the hillside. Is that a morbid thought? There's actually pictures of it. They're just too, they're just hard to see, to be perfectly honest. Well, in the same way that the corpses of failed climbers litter the slopes of Rainbow Valley, the slopes of Christendom are littered with the bodies of people who also did not go the distance. Individuals who set their eyes, who set their affections, who set their ambitions on something short of making it all the way to base camp, something short of going the distance in the Christian life. And you know what? In this room right now, some of us know some of those bodies, right? Some of those corpses on Rainbow Valley. No one of us intends to be one of those corpses, do we? Of course not. All of us want to make it to base camp. All of us want to go the distance. And so for this reason, we need to understand what it is that the book of Hebrews is continuing to say to us about going the distance in the Christian life. And again, this passage is very sobering. It's a sobering passage. The last two chapters, chapters 2, 3, and 4 in the book of Hebrews have been sobering messages. And so fortunately, if you're tired of those, we're going to be out of chapter 4 after next week. Ooh. But we're still finishing up the Christ Ultimatum. That's why I named these chapters, this volume in the book of Hebrews, as I did, because the author of Hebrews is so concerned that we're going to be just another corpse on Rainbow Valley. And so he's encouraging us. He's exhorting us. He's just pulling, out everything he can pull out just to get us to the distance, to get us to base camp. So let's look at our text, Hebrews 4, 1 through 11. So God's promise of entering his rest still stands. Now that sounds pretty nice, doesn't it, so far? His promise of entering his rest still stands. But look where he goes with this. So we ought to tremble with fear. Okay. That some of you might fail to experience it. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them. He's referencing what we looked at last week, the God crowd, the people who were following the presence of God and the promises of God out of captivity in Egypt as slaves to God's place of promise, to the promised land of Israel. And so this is a reference there. For this good news that God has prepared this rest it has been announced to us just as it was to them, but it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listened to God. And for only we who believe can enter his rest. As for the others, God said, in my anger I took an oath, they will never enter my place of rest, even though this rest has been ready since he made the world. We know it is ready because of the place in the scriptures where it mentions the seventh day. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. But in the other passage, God said, they will never enter my place of rest. So God's rest is there for people to enter, but those who first heard this good news failed to enter because they disobeyed God. So God set another time for entering his rest, and that time is today. And God announced this through David much later in the words already quoted, today when you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them this rest, let me hit the pause button there and just explain, because this might be really confusing. What in the world is he talking about? In verses 3 through 10, this is the important thing you need to understand. The author is being very specific about telling his original readers, who would have been Hebrews, Israelites, who would have felt we're okay in our spiritual journey because we're already in the promised land. We're living in the dirt right now that that Moses and then Joshua, his follower, predecessor's Moses, successor. So now I lost myself. So what he's pointing back, what he's wanting to argue for the author of Hebrews is wanting to argue is for his listeners who've actually become complacent in their spirituality because they're in the place where the dirt is. They live in the promised land. And so they think we've arrived, we've summited in the spiritual life. And what he's pointing them to is the fact that, hey, Moses led you out of Egypt, Joshua got you to in the promised land, and this is allegedly the place of rest, but God said much later through King David, 500 years later, the place of rest still stands. And so he's trying to awaken them from this slumber of complacency. The rest is still ahead of you. You're not yet there. Okay, that's the point of 3 through 10. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on 3, actually no time, because that's specifically, the argument for the people who lived on the dirt. And that's not our issue. But complacency is our issue. All right, does that make sense? All right, so I'll pick back up in verse 8. Now, if Joshua had succeeded in giving them rest, in other words, if the dirt you're standing on is really the rest that God promised, God would not he would not have spoken about another day of rest still to come. And so there is a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labors just as God did after creating the world. So all those verses are really just an argument supporting verse 1. God's promise of entering his rest still stands. All right. But this is the conclusion then of all that. The author says to his readers, and the Bible says to us, so let us do our best to enter the rest. That's the command of this passage. Do your best to enter the rest. But if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fall too. We will be corpses on the Rainbow Valley of the spiritual life, just like they did, because they thought they had arrived, and they hadn't. And so the author of Hebrews, just to keep this metaphor going, he's looking through this, these historical binoculars at the Exodus journey of the people of Israel as they're making their way, following the presence and the power of God from captivity in Egypt to freedom in Israel. And the author's looking through these historical binoculars, and he's seeing corpses on Rainbow Valley. That's what he's seeing. And he's using this vision, this illustration, as an example for us to not be that. The author wants us to go the distance on the spiritual journey. He doesn't want us just to summit. He wants us to go the distance, to base camp. Something else that might be interesting to know as we're continuing this metaphor about climbing Everest is in the death zone, above 8,000 meters. There are two factors that combine to create a sense of complacency in the climbers: hypoxia and hypothermia. Hypoxia is you're just running out of oxygen because the oxygen is so thin up there. You're literally dying because you don't have oxygen. And hypothermia, you're freezing to death. Temperatures on top of Everest about 70 below. Winds can hit about 200 mile an hour because you're up in the troposphere of planet Earth. So when you are running out of oxygen and when you are running out of core body temperature, these kind of symptoms start developing in you. You can't think clearly, you can't see clearly, you can't talk clearly. Your sense of judgment, your ability to make rational decisions becomes impaired. And so you'll read stories of climbers on Everest who are freezing to death, but they decide to start stripping clothes off. Right? It just doesn't make sense because you have no oxygen in your brain, or very little oxygen in your brain. You become more clumsy, you lose coordination, you stumble around, and just emotionally you become apathetic, you become unconcerned. And some climbers just even start feeling euphoric because they're freezing to death, and the effect of the absence of oxygen, you start feeling good. And you start feeling sleepy, and then you want to you just want to sit back and relax, take a nap, and when you do, you're dead. Those are the physical effects of hypoxia and hypothermia. To think clearly, to move beyond the dangers, because what you have to see then, because of those things, not only are you in danger because you're running out of oxygen, not only are you in danger because you're freezing to death, but the symptoms of hypoxia and hypothermia will probably cause you to do something stupid, like walk off the side of the mountain or strip down to your skivvies when you're freezing to death. And so you will probably kill yourself before you die. That sort of makes sense. You know what I'm saying? You will do something dumb, you'll do something stupid and kill yourself before the lack of oxygen takes your life. Well, in the same manner, it's easy for us to get a spiritual hypoxia, a spiritual hypothermia, just becoming oxygen deprived in such a way that we're just not thinking straight. And we're getting clumsy in our spiritual life, and we're starting to make some hypoxically stupid decisions. In danger of just walking off the mountain thinking that this is a wise move. And so in the same way that a mountain climber, to break through the confusion, just needs some oxygen so they can start thinking straight and acting straight and choosing straight, so too is the author of Hebrews here, just applying some spiritual oxygen to our lives to break through the confusion of spiritual complacency, spiritual hypoxia, spiritual hypothermia. And so we're going to see in these verses that there are really 4 doses of spiritual oxygen that Hebrews is wanting to apply to us. I'm going to spend most of the rest of our time just on one of those. I'm going to fly through the other 3s, okay? The other 3. So don't worry that we've got 4 points left and not much time. We're going to spend most of our time on the first one. All right. In the opening words of verse 1, and we see this first preventative measure against spiritual complacency, against spiritual hypoxia, and it's the oxygen of perspective. It's the oxygen of perspective. Verse 1, God's promise of entering his rest still stands. God's rest, which is the base camp of our spiritual journey, it's still ahead of you and me. It still stands, the oxygen of Hebrews 1 says. In the same way that Doug Hansen, when he sat down at the top of Everest, contented that he had arrived, he was where he needed to be, he needed some oxygen to clear, to blast through his hypoxic confusion that you're actually not home safe. You're not where you belong. You are still in the death zone, and you need to get up and start taking some steps. You and I, too, need to breathe some oxygen-rich truth. The oxygen of perspective that we have not yet arrived at our ultimate destination. Where you and I are right now in our spiritual trek it's not the finish line. And some of us may be hypoxically confused into thinking that we've arrived, that we've achieved spiritual maturity, that we've summited spiritually. And if we think we've summited spiritually, and especially if we think we've summited spiritually, we can't sit back, we can't relax, we can't take off our oxygen masks and enjoy the view where we are. The writer of Hebrews is saying it's dangerous to do so. That's what the corpses in the Exodus journey did. They thought they had summited, but they hadn't gone the distance. And so it's dangerous for us. Complacency is catastrophic because the finish line is yet out ahead of us, church. We are still now in the death zone. That's what Hebrews 4 is telling us. Now, most of us know that our ultimate destination is still yet ahead of us, right? That's not new news. But our difficulty, like the climber of Everest, our danger is not in what we know in our heads. Our danger is our becoming deliriously complacent or even euphorically complacent in where we are. I'm just contented with where I am, like Doug Hansen dying at the top of Everest. Well, how might that be my danger? Might that be your danger? Well, some of us are in danger. We're complacent because we look back on where we've been, like a mountain climber who's fatally stopped progressing and is sitting in the death zone simply because they're looking back and seeing that, hey, I've made some progress. Look where I started, way down there, and look where I am now. And they feel good about it. So, too, we might be complacent in the fact that look where I've come from. But the danger is if we've actually catastrophically stopped progressing from where we are now, we haven't budged an inch in years of following Jesus, we might be in danger of being another corpse on the Rainbow Valley of the Christian life. You see that? Second, we might become complacent, having lost perspective, having lost the oxygen of perspective in looking at who we're with. You know, like a mountain climber sitting on the death zone, contented to have been part of the crowd of people who made it up from where they started, or even content to be part of the people who have summited. But the climber who is catastrophically unconcerned about further progress from that point forward. So too, you and I might be catastrophically complacent in the fact that we look at people that we started with and they're on fire for Jesus and we seem to have summited together and they're on fire for Jesus and they're still moving forward, but you're not progressing from where you are. We can't be contented that I'm going to make it to base camp just because they're on their way to base camp. Do you understand that? It's catastrophic complacency if we continue to not progress. We're in danger of perhaps being another corpse on the Rainbow Valley of the mountain of life. Some of us might be catastrophically complacent at just looking at who's behind us down the mountain. You know, like a mountain climber who was sitting in the death zone, catastrophically stopped progressing, but looking down the mountain look at all those people I'm out ahead of. I am so much better shape than they are. I beat them here. They're way behind me. But if they're not progressing, what's going to happen? They're dead. right? In the same way, spiritually, if you and I are taking our contentment, if we become complacent just because we've grown more than other people we know, but we haven't grown, we haven't budged an inch in years, we might be concerned that we're stuck in the death zone. We're not going to go the distance. We might become just another multicolored down jacket on the rainbow valley of life. Well, there's also a danger of what we might call summit mentality, just believing that we have arrived, like Doug Hansen from our opening illustration. You might be catastrophically complacent that you've arrived in the Christian life, that you've had some sort of summit experience that you equate to be arrival at your final destination. The original readers of Hebrews would have understood this summit mentality that the author is addressing because, as I said before, they believe they summited because they are living literally on the dirt of promise. But the writer of Hebrews says, no, that's not the destination. They might have believed that they had summited because not only were they living in the promised land, but they had possession of the precepts of God. They were living in the privileges of God's power. They were experiencing God's presence. They were on the whole a pretty good people. They might have pointed to any one of those things or all those things as summit experiences as proof that they've arrived. But in spite of these summit experiences, the writer of Hebrews is looking at them through these historical binoculars, and he's seeing them as corpses, right? None of those summit experiences equate to going the distance spiritually. And so we too face some of those same dangers. The same danger of having a summit mentality, like the complacent thought that we've arrived simply because of the dirt we're standing on, the crowd we're hanging around with. We've got possession of God's precepts. I got a Bible, I carry it around with me. It's a big King James Bible even. I'm really summited, all right? You might know some God stories. You might have experiences the privileges of God's power. You've done some good stuff in your life. You might be one of the good guys, one of the pretty good people, but none of these summit experiences, Hebrew tells us, in and of themselves, will take you the distance from the death zone to the base camp, from the true rest that is still ahead of us, in the same way that it didn't work for the summit seekers of Exodus. We can't become complacent where we are. That's point number 1 of Hebrews 4:1. If you don't want to be a body littering the slopes of failed spirituality, you need to have this confused complacency broken up with the oxygen of this truth, this perspective that base camp is still out in front of us. From where we are now, it's still out in front of us. Don't settle, don't settle, don't settle, church. All right, second part of verse 1 gives us a second preventative measure against complacency. Here the author of Hebrews is wanting to apply to us the oxygen of fear. The oxygen of fear. So we ought to tremble in response to this perspective that God's place of rest is still out in front of us. So we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. And so it's interesting that this incredible promise of God's eternal rest, of heaven lying out before us, that the effect the author wants to produce in us by pointing us to that is fear. Doesn't that strike you as being a weird thing? I mean, if I would have written the book of Hebrews, I would have said, hey, it's still out in front of us, so come, isn't that exciting? Let's get excited about that. But the author of Hebrews says it's still out in front of us, so you ought to tremble with fear that you might miss it. Now I think if some of us are honest, well, maybe if you're like me, I bristle whenever I read the passages in the Bible that tell us about fearing. Anybody else want to admit that you get bugged by those verses? Okay, 2 people who are honest. No, maybe, 3 of us. All right. If I had written the Bible, I would have left those parts out too. Because it just seems to me that fear has no place in the Christian life. But the Bible actually tells us in places like Hebrews 4:1 that there is a place for fear in the Christian journey, that there are things that we need to fear. And yet there are also places, and this is very curious in Scripture, where we're told, I think I thought I heard one earlier. I think it was after first service. Sheldon read a passage where Jesus says, don't fear. Don't fear. Don't be afraid. And so we see in Scripture this kind of contradictory message. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Fear God. Perfect love casts out fear, and God is perfect love. If you want to be smart, the beginning of wisdom is to fear God. Which is it? There's one place in the Gospels, Jesus is teaching a crowd of people, and he says like 3 or 4 times, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. Oh, you should fear the one who can throw your body and soul in hell, but don't be afraid. Which is it? We won't deal with this morning, but there'd be a great message in there. To fear or not to fear? That's the question. To fear, I don't know. What should I do? Well, this is our short answer to it. It's both. The Bible clearly teaches that there are some things in our spiritual track that we ought to fear, and at the same time, there are some things that we ought not to fear. And I'm personally convinced that part of the reason we're so uneasy about the place of fear in the Christian life is because we've got the wires crossed. We fear the things that the Bible tells us that we ought not fear, and we're not afraid of the things that the Bible says we really ought to be afraid of. But that's a sermon for another time. Hebrews 4:1 clearly says, be afraid. Be very afraid. Fear. Tremble with fear. The Bible here is administering to us the oxygen to clear up this sense of euphoria we have about where we are right now. You feel good about who you are? Here, breathe this a little bit. Now what do you fear? Well, feel. Because it should be fear. It should be fear. That's clear-headed Christianity when we're still living in the death zone, church. And what is it that we're to fear? It's you. That's who you need to fear. I need to fear me. You need to fear you. We saw this in last week's message. We need to fear this genetic condition in us, this genetic predisposition to wander, to mistrust, to disbelieve, and to disobey ourselves, disobey right off the side of the mountain. That's what's in me. And that's what's in you too. And we should be afraid of that. We should be very afraid of that. God is not the one whom Hebrews 4:1 tells us that we should be afraid of. God here is like the guide who's like fighting, doing everything for us to get us safely down the mountain, to protect us from our hypoxic stupidity, to protect us from our complacency. But that's our danger. That's who we're supposed to feel. Fear here is that it's in our hearts to pursue a desire. It's in our hearts to pursue a thought. It's in our hearts to pursue some ambition. It's in our hearts to pursue some person right off the edge of the mountain. Amen? Do you know that's there in your heart? And so if we don't want to be a body on the side of the mountain, if we don't want to be in the rainbow valley of failed spirituality, we need to keep pressing ahead, first of all because of this oxygen of perspective. Base camp is still in front of us. We've not arrived. No matter where you are, you've not arrived. But more so, we can keep going because of this oxygen of fear, this honest, self-appraising fear of knowing what is in us. Knowing that I'm capable of hypoxic stupidity. And knowing as I look at the lives of people I know, and maybe people you know, as you look at them, whose bodies, whose corpses are littering the slopes of Rainbow Valley, to know this to be true. There but for the grace of God go I. There, but for the grace of God, go you, too. We haven't arrived. We ought fear. That's clear, oxygenated thinking. Well, the third oxygen that the author of Hebrews is wanting to apply to us is the oxygen of faith. And we see this in verses 2 and 3. For this good news that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was to them, but it did them no good, because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. Now, I'm not going to spend hardly any time at all on this oxygen of faith because we're going to treat it fully in chapter 11. That's what Hebrews 11 is all about. By God's grace, we're going to get there this fall, maybe. First service laughed at that too. I don't know why that's so funny. It's almost like you don't believe me. But here's the sneak preview, by the way. Faith is an absolutely essential oxygen to go the distance in the Christian life. Faith is absolutely essential. You will not make it to base camp without the oxygen of faith. But faith is not just merely possession of an intellectual body of truths. Faith is not just information in your head. Faith is action. That's what we're going to see in Hebrews chapter 11. Think of it this way. If you think of a mountain climber like Doug Hansen sitting at the summit of Everest, having somebody say to him, you're in the death zone. I know that. You know there's not enough oxygen to live here longer than 48 hours. I know that. You know that if you sit here for very long, you're going to freeze to death. I know that. Right? I've read a lot of books about Everest. It's all in my head. Does any of that information help Doug Hansen? No. Faith means nothing if it's not coupled with obedience. That's what we're going to see in Hebrews 11, and it's the same thing is true for us. It doesn't matter what you know. It doesn't matter that you've got your big King James Bible. It doesn't matter that you've taken theology classes. If you're stuck in the same place you've always been, if you are not responding in obedience to the truths the Lord has spoken to you, it's not good. It's not good. It's not good. Faith. We'll get there in chapter 11. But that really leads into the final point that the author wants to make to us in verse 11. The last breath of clarity he wants to breathe into our oxygen-depleted confusion. Confusion is the oxygen of diligence. Verse 11, this is how he sums it all up. So, as a result of all these other things we've been talking about, here's the command: do your best to enter the rest. Do our best to enter the rest, because if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, we will fall. We will die. We will come up short of the base camp. In other words, he's saying, work. Make good choices. Do your best. Take the next step. Get up off this, the laurels of your complacency right now, and take a step in the right direction. Take a step of obedience. It's not enough just to know. It's not enough just to fear. It's not enough just to believe. We need to take a step in the right direction. Let me illustrate this with this closing story going back to the 96 failed summit attempt. Rob Hall, the New Zealander guide, refused to leave Hansen, who was unconscious at the top of the mountain. He felt this obligation. I talked this man into climbing this mountain. I'm going to get him back down. Long after, 12 hours actually, after Hansen was completely unconscious, Hall was still sitting with his body just a couple hundred feet south of, below the summit. He had radioed for Harris to come up and help him. Harris, as far as we can understand, recreating the story, Hansen made it up, and then Hansen disappeared. Harris disappeared. Hansen dies, and Hall is sitting at the top of the mountain, a couple hundred feet shy of the summit. He radios the base camp. He says, I'm freezing. I can't go any further. And they're like, Rob, get up. Rob, keep going. He's like, I'm okay. I'm okay. They patch him through to his wife in New Zealand. She's 7 months pregnant with their first child. How you doing, hon? Rob, get up. Get up. Stand up. Keep going. I'm fine. Rob, get up. I'm fine. And that's where they found Rob Hall's body 2 weeks later. It wasn't enough to know where he was. It wasn't enough to know he was in danger. It wasn't enough to know that base camp was still down there, and that was the place of safety. He had to get up and take a step from where he was. But by that time, he was just so oxygen deprived in his thinking that he couldn't even choose to do the thing he needed to do. That is the danger that is before us in becoming complacent with where we are. That there may be some obvious step that you need to take in your life. There may be some obvious step that I need to take in my life to get up, because you're going to die where you are. That's the step. That's the step we need to take. That's the step of diligence. Let us do our best to enter that rest, or we will fall. Let's stand and